All right, so we're going to get started. Hope you guys all had a good weekend, and happy Valentine's Day to each and every one of you. Thanks for showing up this early on a Monday morning. We're going to get started today. This one's actually a little bit different than we've done in the previous lectures, where normally I show some slides first, and then after we go through the kind of the lecture portion, then we do some demo. Today's going to be straight into the demo, and this is going to take the bulk of your time. So remember, on these exercises, they're designed to take about 2 hours. So once you start working on this, it should take you about 2 hours. I would say most people it will take the full 2 hours. If you don't quite make it through both, show me however far you get, show me that part. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So let's get this figured out. And then I need to do a little bit of arranging, so bear with me for a second. All right. Perfect. So I've gone ahead and I've pulled up our remote desktop machine. As I've done every other class day, I'm using that to demonstrate because I have the clicks available so that you can see what my clicks are, what my keystrokes are, etc. So that's good to go. For today, we're going to work on this exercise 108. And exercise 108 is actually challenging and complicated. And so I'm going to go through and I'll actually demonstrate this for you. But essentially what we're going to do is we're going to do our first bit of collage work, where we're taking something that doesn't belong in a scene and we're putting it into a scene and we're making it feel like it's part of that particular scene. So we need a couple things. One, we need an image to start from. That image, I have some samples down here at the bottom. You're more than welcome to choose one of these sample scenes. And actually that'll be one of the ones that I use. We're going to do a city street and we're going to do a landscape. So they take a little bit of different challenges as you work through them. So I'm going to show you both. We're going to pick two of those scenes and we're going to work on those scenes. Then we need an image that we've isolated. So a picture of a person, and it needs to be a whole person, so including the feet. And we're going to take that person and stick it in the scene and make it look like they belong. And so the first kind of part is finding an image that works, a background image. Now, of course, if you took a background image of a street, you could use one of your own background images. I've done some quick searches online. Here's the Unsplash website, and I pulled up empty street. This one's a little bit challenging because some of the streets are a little bit more artistically photographed than they would otherwise be. We're looking for a street that's in the sun. So something like this would actually work rather nicely to be able to pick this image. Actually, you know what? Since I haven't done this one before, let's go ahead and do this one. Let me download it, and we'll use that as my street example here. There it is. So any image like this, the one that I typically use is this one. I like this one a lot because I can show you how the curb works. Do I have a curb example in that? Well, we'll take a look and see. Let's see. Let's show in the folder. Let's go ahead and open that. Perfect. Yeah, there is a little bit of a curve there. It's not as pronounced as the other one, so it's a little bit harder for me to demonstrate. So maybe I will go back to that original one just so that I can show you. Let's go right here. I'm going to use this one. So let's download that in its full resolution. All right. Let's open that one up. There we go. So again, it really doesn't matter. The only reason I'm picking this is because of that curve. I can walk you through how to wrap the shadow around the curve. That's all. So the first thing that starts with any one of these images, if we want to collage into this image, we need to really understand what's happening in the image. Where is the sunlight coming from, and or how would we best integrate a person into this scene? So if I'm going to use a paintbrush here in red just so that I can kind of illustrate some stuff as we're talking about. So the first thing that I'm looking for is, where is the sun coming from in this particular image? Well, I can tell by the shadows being cast. So if we look at this light post here, we can look to the wall. There's the shadow that this light post is cast. I can tell that the sun's somewhere up over in this corner, and it's shining down across our scene. And we can get the actual angle by kind of looking at things that reflect. So let me undo that for just a second. That comes down and hits that. This edge here comes down and hits over there. So we can kind of get this general sense for what we're hitting in these various positions. So once we kind of know that general idea of where the light's coming from, the next thing we need to understand is, where is what's called the horizon line. And it's always a little bit complicated in these images, because like this image is sloping slightly downhill. You can see by the little bit of an angle that's going on right there. Let me turn that back on. Actually, let me give another layer that I can draw on. There we go. So we've got a little bit of a downhill slope. So the horizon is actually a little bit higher than it would otherwise be. But generally the horizon, assuming it was an eye level photograph, should be right about at the center of the image. So in this case, because it's sloping downhill, I'd say the horizon is right about there or so. If we looked over here at this image, right, this image is slightly uphill. So the horizon is going to be a little bit lower. You can also kind of cheat. If there's a person in the scene, there's a person right there. Generally, a person's eye level is approximately where the horizon was. So that's about where I would imagine that horizon to be. So somewhere right about there is our horizon line. And so the reason that this matters is because once we determine where that is, if we want a person to be entered into the scene, we need to place their eye level approximately on that horizon line. And how big or small they are will change where they're positioned in a particular scene. Let me bring a person in as an example here. So let me go to File, and then let's go to Place. I'm going to use Place Embedded. And let's go to our work from last class. This was it, I think. Now, I don't know if this person actually works from a light standpoint, so we'll get to that in a second. But obviously, she's way too big right there. But if I shrink her down, and I put her eye roughly on, oops, come on, stay in proportion. There we go. And I put her eye roughly on the horizon line, she'll feel like she's positioned either closer or further away from you. So if I shrink her, as long as I put her eyes on that horizon line, somewhere right there, she just gets further away. If I bring her closer, get her bigger, and I put her eye on that horizon line, she'll feel like she's much closer to us. So that's a key part of this image. Now, same thing would occur on this. If I were to put somebody in, I need to make sure that their eye is approximately there. I'm not asking you when you work on doing this collage work to actually draw in where the horizon line is, but it helps to think through, where is that horizon line? So if I were to bring that same image in, let me go to File and then Place Embedded. And I'll drop her into the scene. Obviously, I need to shrink her down. Now, I should point out that when you bring the image in, you can resize the image, and the proportions stay locked as long as you don't press any keys. You used to have to push the Shift key to get things to stay in proportion, but you don't anymore. So as long as her eye is on the horizon line, we're okay. And that's going to control where she lands in the scene, how far away she is from us, etc. Now, if I look carefully at her, though, the sun that's shining on her, or the light that's shining on her, is shining on this side right there. And the shadows, oops, sorry about that. And the shadows on the back edge of her legs, back edge of her arms, back edge of her hair there. So in this particular scene, the light for her is coming from the wrong direction. So if I were to stick her in this scene, she wouldn't look right because of that lighting problem. So instead, I want to flip her around. I'll go into the edit menu and I'm going to go into transform and I'm going to flip horizontal. And now she's the opposite direction. And if we look at it now, the shadows are on the correct side of her to be in this particular scene. Now there's some subtlety as well about people and where the shadows are coming from, how far around is the sun. She's not too far away, but I think this photo may have happened in a little bit different lighting conditions because the shadows aren't as stark as they are in this particular scene. You can browse through your images. You can find other images that have been cut out. Hopefully they're Creative Commons licensed. On the course website, the digital tools site, there are a bunch of other images that have already been cut out. I've gone through and I've looked at a variety of images, and I should have some just so you can see. So here's some other people that I've used in the past. I can use this one, for example. Let me, I'm gonna have to bring it in. Let me go to File and then Place. I'm gonna do a place. Oh, I have to commit to this position for her. Then I'll go to File and then Place Embedded. And so I could take her, for example, and I could place her in the scene. And the same sort of thing exists. Now in this scenario, right, the shadow's on this side, so it's backwards the same way. So I would have to flip her as well. So I go up to my edit menu and I go to transform, and we're going to flip horizontal. And so now the shadow's on this side of her and the highlight is on the back side of her. So that's not too bad. Now, same thing about sizing her. I need to make sure that her head ends up down roughly on the horizon line. And if I want her to go further back into the scene, I just make her a little bit smaller. Oops, maybe that was too small. And I can control where she ends up being in the particular scene. Now, there's always a little bit of play here. So, you know, if she's shorter, she may be slightly below where that horizon line is. If she's taller, she might be slightly above. So once you get it approximate, then kind of look at the scene and decide, does she feel right? Does she need to go down a little bit more? What makes her feel about right in the scene? So I'm going to turn her off for a second. We'll concentrate on this first one. And so right now, not that, I mean, you'd be walking in the middle of a city street with bare feet, but we'll use her as the example. So I have her installed in the scene. We can do some touching up. We can do some dodging and burning to darken up those shadows and make her feel a little bit more like she's part of the scene. But let's work on the primary integration into the scene. So I'll take her, and in order for her to feel integrated into the scene, I have to look very carefully at her feet. And so right now, if I covered up the bottom half and we look just at the top half, she doesn't look too bad. She kind of feels like she's part of the scene. Down at the bottom, she looks like she's completely floating and not part of the scene. So we need to find a way to ground her into this scene. And we're going to do that through the use of a shadow. So let's go to the File menu and we'll bring in that silhouette that we previously created. And so there's a method to my madness here. If I go to Place Embedded, let's go back to the gray. There's the shadow. So we created this gray silhouette to use as a shadow. So let me go ahead and flip it. So I'll go back to my image and then, edit, transform, flip horizontal. Then we need to shrink her down so that they're the same size. They don't have to be exact, but frequently I'll put them over the top of each other as I do this, just to kind of make sure that I'm getting to the right approximate size. All right, so that's pretty close in terms of shadow. I'm going to rename this layer. So I'll double click on the layer here, and I'm going to call this shadow. And actually, let me do for organization purposes, I'm going to do W1-shadow, and I'm also going to change this to be W1, just to start organizing. We'll take the orange, whatever that woman was, and we'll move her down below and leave her off. I'm also at this point going to turn off my horizon line, and I'm going to work with just the woman and her shadow. So obviously the shadow shouldn't be standing vertically. So the next piece of this is I have to start to anticipate where is the shadow going to fall on the ground. So we can see kind of these light posts are great indicators of where the shadow is. So our shadow is going to roughly fall in this direction. And our distance of shadow, we're going to look at the height, and we're going to look at where the angle of the sun typically sets. So the end of our shadow is going to end up to be right about there. So we need to take the shadow and get it so that it's laying down flat. And we'll do this using the edit, transform, and then skew. So edit, transform, and skew. And this allows us to start to control the shadow. Now, this part really takes some practice. But essentially what you're going to do is you're going to start manipulating using these corners. And it's a weird kind of work your way down. Oops. So I'm trying to get her head and hair approximately where they want to be. This is in a slight bit of perspective. So the top of the shadow should be a little bit narrower than the bottom. We need to move this so that it lines up roughly with where her feet are. So that shadow should touch the bottom of her foot. This one's picked up in the air. So realistically, it's going to be a little bit lower than where her shadow is. Let's move this. This needs to get over further. So we get our angle right. So our angle still isn't quite right. We need to go over just a little bit further. So I keep working and manipulating these corners to start to get the angle correct. Let's pull this.
Wait, which tool are you using for the transform?
Just this is a skew. It's under edit, transform, and then skew.
Okay,
right there.
thank you.
There are other ones to play around with. Warp. A lot of people like warp. If you're working on warp, it's going to give you more curved options. So if you're trying to project a shadow across a curve, but I'd like to try to keep it simple today. So if we're doing it on a flat ground, doing the skew tends to work the best. Thank you for interrupting and asking the question. That's important, and I'm glad you asked.
Yeah, thank you.
No, it's okay. Don't feel bad. Okay, so the other thing, if you're struggling to line things up, you can use the arrow keys on your keyboard to help kind of line things up. So you can see right now that I'm starting to get the angle right. And we keep addressing it. And like I said, this part, it does take some practice to really identify exactly what's happening and how to move these together. But we're starting to get pretty close. So now I've got this shadow that's applying. I'm making sure that this foot is touching. So if I were to press Control+ to zoom in, I'm holding down spacebar to move. We can see that that toe is touching. This toe, because she's running, is off the ground. And so this shadow should be not directly touching that toe where this one should be. So we're paying a lot of attention. And if we jump back for a second, let me press Control-0 to see everything. If we jump back, we can start to see that certainly if we just looked at this toe, now this is starting to feel like she's standing on the street rather than floating because she's casting a shadow. Okay, so I have the shadow relatively in line here. I'm going to go ahead and switch the order of this layer. So I'm going to take the woman and I'm going to put, excuse me, her on top of the shadow. And notice that now this foot is on top of that shadow. So that's good. The next thing is that typically shadows have a little bit of a softer edge to them. So if we look at, let's zoom in here. Oops, sorry, that was a Mac key command. Here we go. Control+, and we look at these shadows, oops, stop, wrong. I was in a zoom mode, there we go. Go away. Okay, so if we look down here, we can tell that these shadows have a little bit of a softer edge compared to the edge of the shadow that I've been working with. So on that shadow layer, let's go up to the filter menu, and I'm going to go to blur, and I'm going to choose a Gaussian blur. And let's move this over. Oh, sorry, this is the wrong layer. I want to be on the shadow layer. There we go. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur. And let's see if we can find, there it is. We need a radius probably of about a pixel. If you check and uncheck the preview box, you should be able to see the blur happen. That looks pretty good. We'll go ahead and say, okay. So it blurred the edge. It's not as sharp anymore. But notice also right now that the shadow is just completely dark. And shadows, while they're dark, are really just darkening what's around them. They're not masking out what's around them. So we actually need to take that shadow and go up here into blending mode, and we're going to use the multiply blending mode on our shadow. And when we do that, you can see that the shadow is now showing through to the street below. So it's looking much more like a shadow. If I compare this shadow, however, to the existing shadows, it's too dark. So let's take the shadow layer and let's change the opacity down. And I'm guessing it's about 90, maybe 85 or so, somewhere in there. So you have to keep kind of playing with it so we can get the shadow to be about the right darkness value. The other problem, though, with this shadow is that the shadow isn't the same color. So this image has a little bit of a blue tint, and our shadow is perfectly neutral. There's no blue tint, there's no red tint to it. So we need to adjust the tone of that shadow just a little bit. So here comes the next part. We're going to go up to our layer. We're going to choose a new adjustment layer. And we have a couple options. We can use the hue and saturation adjustment, or we can use the color balance adjustment. I think the hue and saturation for me tends to work better, but you can try either one. We'll call this hue and saturation. That's fine. We'll say OK. And so what I can do is I can adjust the general hue of this shadow by dragging this slider a different direction. Now I'm going to go way too far for a second so you can hopefully see it. Now, but you probably can see that I'm messing with the shadow in the image. So that's a problem. I really only want the shadow to apply to the shadow layer. So we're going to use a command on the keyboard. It's Control-Alt-G, and it's going to essentially tie this shadow here, or this color change, to just the shadow. So I'm going to press Control-Alt-G on the keyboard. Ooh, that definitely didn't do what it was supposed to do. Sorry. Let's try that one more time. Control-Alt-G. Nope. Apparently, my key commands don't work the same way in Rhino. Let me, or excuse me, in the remote desktop. Let me tie these together. Here it is. Create clipping mask. So I'll go up to layer. I'm so used to using the keyboard shortcuts. We're going to use the create clipping mask, Alt-Control-G. And there we go. And it's applying our changes to just the shadow. So now if I mess with this, we should get to a point where we can change the color. Come on. I'm going to up the saturation. See if we can get it to take effect here. There we go. So I bumped the saturation up so I had more control. Obviously, I didn't need it that high. But there's a place, if I bump this up, where my shadow is going to start to take on that bluish tint, which it's doing. It's a little bit strong. So let me come back to my shadow And we'll drop this down a little bit more. A little bit less, and right about there. So now if I step back, let me press Control-0. Maybe not. Let's try that one more time. Control-0. There we go. The shadow is about the same color and darkness as the shadow over here, or the shadow here. Actually, it's probably just a little bit darker to my eye. So let's drop it down maybe a little bit more. There we go. So we're looking for that similarity. And now she starts to feel like she belongs in the scene. Sure, her foot is touching that shadow. The shadow feels like it belongs to this scene, etc. So that's good. So we've kind of worked through that. Now we can play around a little bit and work with her specifically to kind of darken that backside so that the sun is a little bit better. So we could do that using a dodge and burn layer. So let's go to Layer, New Layer. We're going to change our blending mode on that to overlay. We're going to fill with that 50% gray. This is a dodge and burn. So let me rename this. And we'll say OK. And when I created the layer, it was in between the hue and saturation and the shadow. We don't actually want it there. We want to work on the woman herself. So let's bring that all the way up to the top of the layer stack. But we do want to tie it to the layer directly below it. So I'll go back up to Layer, and I'll choose my Create Clipping Mask. And so that dodge and burn is applying only to the woman. We can then come in with our burn tool. And let's zoom in. I'm going to press Control+ here. Look at her leg. And we'll darken the backside of her leg. So I'm going to do this in a couple passes. Might need to darken the backside of her arm a little bit. So I'm just kind of working to enhance that shadow just a bit. So you get the idea here, where I'm just working that just a little bit to make sure that she feels like she's part of the scene. So I'm adjusting that. Alternatively, if I needed to lighten the front side of her front side is pretty light to begin with, but I could come through and I could lighten up, you know, the edge of this just to make it look like there's a little bit more sun on her. Maybe about like that. So you can tweak the light. You can't fix it. You can't make it go, you know, from a different direction. Oops, sorry, Control-0. There we go. Can't make the light come from a different direction, but you can get it so that she starts to feel much more like she's part of the particular scene. So we talked a little bit about what about the curb. And so if I were to turn these off right now, so she's not there. Let me turn on this lady. And this lady is walking toward the curb, which makes it kind of nice when we work on her shadow. So let's move her around just a little bit. Okay, that feels about right. I'm going to do the same thing where I'm going to bring in her shadow. So let me go to File and then Place Embedded. And this was in a different folder. So hold on a second here. There's her shadow. Same thing, I need to flip it. So we'll go to my Edit and then Transform, and we're going to flip horizontal. We'll shrink this down. So you can tell that you don't really have to start by making these the same size. I've just always found that these work a little bit better if we get the shadows to be approximately the same size. All right, so they're approximately the same size. I'll commit to that size, and then I'm going to go into my Edit, Transform, and then Skew. And I will once again work on getting her shadow into perspective here. Now this one's a little tough because there's a curb that's happening right here. So we need to think about her shadow as if she weren't up against the curb. And so sometimes it's actually beneficial to move these. So I could have started the shadow back over here, just so you can have a little bit more runway with your shadows. Okay, it's not bad. So you have to ignore the upper part, but it's not bad the way it is. So let's go ahead and let me rename this to be W2-shadow. And we'll rename this to be W2. And one of the things that can be helpful in these is once we're done with the first, so in this case, it's the first woman here, I can select all of the layers and then make a group with those layers. And then we can call this W1. And that then allows me to kind of stack the original woman here. So if I were to turn all of these back on, there she is. I can also control the whole thing using that group. Okay, so we're back to this one. I have my W2 and my W2 shadow. Just like we did before, we're going to change the shadow to be a multiply. Definitely too dark right now. We're also going to make sure that the woman is on top of her shadow. There we go. So the shadow's behind her. That's good. And then we're going to go ahead and adjust the opacity. So we were down at about 50%, if I'm not mistaken. There we go. Our color tone is slightly off. So same thing that I did before with the hue and saturation. I'm going to go to layer, new adjustment layer, hue and saturation. We're going to attach it. So I'll go up to my layer and then say create clipping mask. That attaches it just to the shadow. We will boost my saturation up and we'll boost the color over into the blue range until we get enough blue in the shadow. There we go. So the shadow's there, the blue is about right, all of that looks good. Now I'm not going to do the Gaussian blur quite yet because I'll need to manipulate this shadow. So let's zoom in. I'll press Control+. I'm going to hold down space bar so that I can pan. And so we can see in this shadow that the shadow from her comes over here and it hits this curb. So the shadow wouldn't go straight through. That's not realistic. So it hits the curb and it would end up going straight up along the curb, and then it would continue. So we need to manipulate this shadow. So right now the shadow is a referenced file. It's been placed in, and we can tell that on the layer palette here because it has a little file next to it. And if we click on that image or that layer, we can also right click it and say, oops, sorry, wrong end. Here we go. Right click it. And so we can say embed. Oh, excuse me, rasterize layer. And when we rasterize layer, that shadow gets officially applied into this. It's no longer, it doesn't have this little reference anymore. When that happens, we can actually start to manipulate it. So I'm going to use my Polygonal Lasso tool. So the regular Lasso tool allows you to select things by drawing kind of a circle around it. The Polygonal Lasso, which is below it, will allow us to click and draw a straight line. So I've clicked. I'm going to draw a straight line right there along that curb edge. And then I'll just select the rest of this shadow. I'll come back. When I touch the two ends, my cursor gets a little circle next to it. That'll close the selection. And then as long as I'm on the shadow layer, I can go to the Move tool. And I can essentially move this straight up. If I hold down Shift, it'll help me keep it just in a line until I get up toward the top of the shadow. Right there. So now in all reality, the shadow gets a little bit shorter when it's going up and then over, but it's a little bit harder to deal with that. So I'm okay with us shortening the shadow. And we will now use that Polygonal Lasso again to draw a new selection that goes from this edge right here up to our shadow. Now, this is a little bit complicated because if you look over here, there's an extra little lip on the curb. So we want to try to mimic that if we can. So we'll come up and we'll come over a little bit. Maybe about like that. And likewise, this would be coming kind of down. And then over, and then we'd be coming down to join with the rest of our shadow. So I've drawn where I want that shadow to go. Now I need to be able to copy this gray. So let me turn everything else off so that you can see this happen a little bit easier. And so I want to sample. So I'm going to use my paintbrush, but in order to get that color of gray, I'm going to sample. Let me turn, I want to be consistent, so everything's off here. I'm going to sample that color of gray. So I use the eyedropper tool to sample the gray. It's now shown in my foreground color. And I can then use my paintbrush tool to paint, oh, come on, there we go, to paint that gray into this spot. Let me change my, it's decided to be really slow on me, so I apologize. I'm going to change my hardness to 100%. And that way I don't have any soft edges. I'm going to fill this in. Like that. So I have that filled in. I'll use the rectangular marquee and just click once so that I can see that shadow as it goes around the curve. Let's turn back on the scene, and you can see that that shadow now goes up over the curve. If I turn the woman back on, let's see, where's W2? There it is. You can see that her shadow is now being cast up and over the curve. That's part of this integration, is you have to pay attention to what's happening in these various streets. You know, if we look really carefully on these tracks, there's a little bit of a shadow indentation. We can skip over some of it because our detail doesn't need to be super. Let me go with the shadow selected. I'm going to go up to filter, and then I'm going to go to my blur, Gaussian blur. I waited until after I manipulated the shadow before I did the Gaussian blur. We'll do it at 1 inch or 1 pixel. And now we have that shadow going up and over the curve. Let me press Control-0 so we can see everything in our scene. There's that shadow. Let's turn back on my original there. And so you can see the two. This color looks still a little bit off to me. I think we need to go back there just a little bit more. So you have to keep playing sometimes to get everything just right, okay? So now I've integrated those two people into the scene. The shadows match up at the foot level. This one probably could use a little bit more shadow on this side of the foot, but that's starting to get really particular, okay? So this is integrating into a scene where we have kind of a flat ground and we have a pavement ground. So the shadow edges are going to be relatively sharp. So this is the first half of what I'm asking you for in the exercise. Let me bring this back up here. In exercise 108, right there. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Maybe not, maybe a little bit bigger still. There we go. Next piece is that I'm going to have you do the opposite of the scene. So we started with the city scene, and now we want to play around with one of the landscape scenes. So I have 4 landscape scenes here that I've previously identified as samples. You can, of course, choose any one of your own. You could do, I think, from a Google search or a Unsplash here. We could do, let's do grassy meadow, or maybe just meadow. Right, so we're looking for something that has strong light in it, where we can kind of identify shadow. So here's one. Now this one would be rather challenging because the sun's in front of us, so the shadow would be coming back toward us if we were trying to integrate it. So we need to make sure that our original image had that kind of a lighting condition to it. Some of these are actually good examples, and we could learn a lot from them just by looking at them, right? So there's a person standing there. Look at the shadow that's being cast. So it's very different than the shadows that we just did on pavement. Another example here, right? Look at how the grass covers up his feet. You can't even see his feet. So when we do this integration, we have to do something very similar, where we have to hide the feet, etc. So you guys can play around with looking for your own image, or of course you could pick one of my images. Okay, so this one has a little bit shorter grass. I have another one here. I think it's this one that has some longer grass. Yeah, this one. The challenge with this one is that the sun is very, very high, which means that the shadow is very small. It's almost straight down. This one, if you look at the shadows, they're being cast against the mountains. They're a little bit longer going away from you. So either one of these would work just fine. Let me go ahead and download this. Maybe I'll end up doing both today. It depends on how the time plays out. Download that original. Let's open it in Photoshop. And let's go ahead and get that other one too while we're here. And we'll download that original. All right, so I have both of those available. I'm going to go ahead and close this one. Just kind of keep things clean. So when we start looking at this, we have to identify where that horizon line is. And the mountains here are hiding where the horizon line would be. So our horizon line is going to be somewhere right about there. In this one, same thing, our horizon line is kind of the edge of that meadow, maybe slightly higher than where that is. So we would want to do the same thing. First thing we need to do is kind of identify where is the light coming from in the scene. So we've got kind of a steep shadow. The sun would be over here on the left, shining down on our objects. In this scene here, the sun is very much overhead, maybe slightly. You can kind of see some streaks coming from it right there. It's right about there. So our shadow is going to be coming down very, very vertical. So let's go ahead and try to bring somebody into this scene. So I'll go to File, and I'll go to Place Embedded. And I have some different examples here. Let me look at her. So we've got sun kind of highlighting this side of her, darkness here. I'm not sure why she'd be wearing this in Yosemite. That might be a slight problem. Let's play around with a couple of the other ones. I'm going to get rid of her. Let's go to File, Place, Embedded. Okay, so I've got this couple. The sun is on this side of them, so I would need to flip the sun. So let me go to my Edit, Transform. We're going to flip horizontal. All right, so that's good. So the sun's casting there. Yeah, that could probably work in this particular scene. So let's get them positioned. So we need to shrink their eye level down and then decide where they're going to go in the scene. So let's say they're standing here. That's not the best from a rule of thirds composition. We could have them standing here. That's kind of a little bit of a path, so it's not too bad. All right, so they feel like they're about the right size in this particular scene. We'll go ahead and commit to it. There. And then we'll go to File, and then Place Embedded. And I need to bring their shadow in. There's their shadow. It's backwards, so we'll go back and flip the shadow. I'll go to Edit, Transform, flip horizontal. And we'll shrink the shadow down. Uh-oh. I accidentally, hold on. I didn't keep it in proportion. They got shorter. All right, so we've got their shadow roughly roughly set up here. Did I skew that original image? I think I did. Let's, I'm going to bring those in one more time. Let me go to File and then Place Embedded. Place. We're going to go to Edit, Transform, Flip Horizontal. And all right, so we've got that roughly the same size. Perfect. So now we need to cast that shadow. So I have the people, so we'll call this P1. This layer can actually delete, so we'll select it and then delete it. And we'll call this P1 shadow. There we go. And so we need to skew that to match up with the shadow. So we know it's going down kind of right over in here. It's fairly short. So let's go to our edit and then our transform and skew. And we'll start manipulating these guys. So like I said, it's short. So we need to get this much shorter. Let's swing it around a little bit more. Around a little bit more. Now, because there's two people, lining up the shadows at the base becomes much trickier. So we have to spend a little bit more time at the base. So we've got that foot there, but this needs to be adjusted up until it lines up with his feet as well. All right, so his feet are getting pretty close. Her feet are getting pretty close. I might use the arrow to nudge it just a little bit. And then we'll come back and look at the top a little bit more. That should be flipped over a bit. Yeah, that looks pretty good. So I've got that there. I might use the arrow keys just a bit to adjust. And then we also want to make sure that the shadow is below the original people. There it is. So let's zoom in, Control plus a little bit. That was the wrong command, I'm sorry. Control plus. And we can start to look at it. Not too bad. We need to do a little bit of manipulation here. This just needs to be a little bit higher. And that needs to go over just a little bit more. All right, so we're looking pretty good right there. So same rules apply here, where in our shadow, we need to apply it as a multiply layer. So I'm going to change over here to multiply, so we're seeing through it. Our intensity is probably much less, so we'll drop our intensity down so that we can start to see that. Now, where the shadows start to break down a lot in a scene like this is they have really hard edges. And sure, you could blur the edges like we did, but in reality, the shadows are always going to have a little bit of a grass texture on them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch this back into being a normal mode for just a second, and I'm going to change the opacity back up. We'll get back to fixing those. But I need to make, let's turn everything else off, except the shadow. But I need to make this look like there's kind of a grass texture on it. Now, in this particular scene, the shadow down here is on dirt, so it can be just, you know, relatively hard edged. But up in here where it's on grass, we need to make sure that we have that grass texture. So let me zoom in one more time, Control plus. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the clone stamp tool. So right here, and we're going to use a brush called the grass brush. Now, unfortunately, it's not available by default in here. We actually have to load something called the legacy brushes. So I'm going to click that little gear icon and choose legacy brushes. Yep, go ahead and load those legacy brushes. And under legacy brushes here, we'll expand that. We can look under default, and when we scroll down about halfway, you can even make this a little bit bigger to make it easier to see it. And we're going to find this brush called grass. So we'll pick that grass brush. And it's a little bit hard to do this. Number one, because this is kind of sloping. But number two, this is also a referenced layer. So we need to make sure that we right click on the layer and we say rasterize. That little file reference goes away. And as soon as that file reference goes away, now we can actually do some clone stamp. So as we talked about the clone stamp before, if I were to pick the clone stamp, I would hold down Alt to copy from, and then I'd be creating my grass. Now my grass is a little bit tall right now. So let me undo that. I'm going to press Control Z, and I'm going to shrink that brush size down. So I'll use the bracket key on the keyboard to shrink that little brush down to right about there. And then I could hold down Alt, and along this backside here, I could just copy and create these little grass bits. So let me zoom in so you can see this, Control plus. See how there's little like pixelated grass stalks and it's no longer a nice sharp border. So as I run this along the edge, I'm changing the shadow to have that grass look along that back edge. Now maybe that brush is a little small. We can make it a little bit bigger. I think it needs to go back down there. And I'm going to work my way along the back edge of this shadow. So it's just a bunch of back and forth. Let me press space bar, and I can work my way all the way along this edge of the shadow. The goal being to have the edge of the shadow completely distorted by the grass. Hold down Alt, recopy from here, and keep working up on that section. So when I get to the end, let me hold down Alt here. I can kind of go over the end, but I've got a problem. The front edge here, I can't just copy I need the opposite end of the grass. And I probably should go just a little bit further here. Since I'm here, let me just do this real quick. Whoops. Alt, copy from, and let's get that grass in there. We're just kind of smoothing things out. That'll work. And then we get into where there's much less grass down here at the bottom, so I'm not going to worry about that too much yet. Okay, so I've done the whole backside. Now when it comes to the front side, remember that we're going to be using a multiply layer. And since we're using a multiply, white is going to be transparent. So I can actually do the opposite, but I need this time to clone stamp with white. So I need some white to copy from, and I don't have any. So let me press Control 0. Oops, sorry, that was Control minus is what I wanted. There we go. And I'm going to give myself a box of white. So over here, I'm going to flip my color so that I can paint in white. Just use the regular brush tool. Let's make that nice and big. So this will go fast. And I'm just going to paint in some white. Perfect. I'll use my marquee tool and deselect. Then I can come back to my clone stamp and I can copy from now the white. Then I'll work along the front edge with white. Now, as I said, because this is going to be in a blending mode where we change this to multiply, the white becomes transparent, but you can see what's happening. It's softening that edge now with the grass texture. So this part actually does take some time. And so we'll go back into normal so you can see it happen. We have to keep recopying from our spot up here. So I resample with Alt. We'll work our way along this front edge. So I'm going to go ahead and go all the way to there. Then I could recopy from here and go with the gray over the top of it there to cover that back edge. And then we go back to copying from the white. Copy right over here. Oh, see that line that appeared? That appeared because I ran out of white to copy from. So we'll come down here and start fresh with some new white. There we go. I need a little bit of gray to kind of cover up that part. And then maybe a little bit more white to cover up that little stalk of gray that's in the way. And then we can go back to our white and we can copy along that lower section. Recopy, hold down Alt, recopy, and we'll work our way up that part. So I'm kind of layering these up. I'm doing the white first. Actually, I should have started with the gray here. And then I will cover up that with the gray for the backside of his shadow. Like that. Now, when all of this is done and we convert it over into our multiply, you can start to see how the shadow is being applied as if it were in the grass. Same thing is happening here. And you can tell what a stark difference it is from the original shadow to the one that has that little bit of grass texture on it. This feels much more like it belongs in the scene. If I turn the people back on and I press Control-0, you can tell that that shadow feels like it belongs in the scene, where this one feels like it's sitting on top of the scene. So this obviously takes a lot of work to practice from. I know I'm starting to run short on time, so I wanted to show you that, but I want to show you one other thing that's very important, and that's when somebody's standing in grass that is much deeper. So here they're standing on a path, so there's not a lot of grass there. We don't really need to copy anything to cover up their feet or their legs. In this scene, they'd be standing in much deeper grass. So let me go to File, and then we'll place Embedded. And let's use this one. So we're trying to get the line just right here. The shadow's on the back edge and would be cast there. So we'll go ahead and commit to that. I'll go to File and then Place Embedded. And I would be bringing in her shadow as well. All right, that's good. So we've got our shadow placed in. We would be doing the same skew, only we'd be pulling it toward the front this time because the shadow is slightly to the front, very close to being directly down. But what I want to concentrate on right now is not so much the shadow, because you've seen me do the shadow. It's how do you make it feel like she belongs in the scene instead of floating on top of it. So what we need to do is we need to be able to copy the grass over the top of her feet. And so this takes a little bit more effort than we've previously done. So what I'll do is I'll create a rectangular marquee here. I'm going to select an area that encompasses her feet. From the background layer here, I'm going to copy it. So I'll go to Edit, and then I'll go to Copy. That copies that piece. And then I'll go to Edit, and I'll go to Paste. And that pastes a copy. And you can see there's that little copy that I'm working with. So now on that copy, I'm gonna start to manipulate that copy. And I'll do that by selecting. So I'll use the magic wand tool here. Oops, sorry, next one down. I'm going to select with the lady active. I'm going to select everything that is around her. And I just clicked over here. Then I'm going to go up to the select menu and choose inverse, so that now I just have her selected. And then I'll switch to the copy of the background layer, and I'll press the delete key. And what that does is it cuts out this little piece of grass for where her legs are. So I've cut that out. That obviously works seamlessly. If I turn everything back on, you wouldn't see it because it copied in the exact same place. So let's zoom in here. Sorry, wrong menu item. Keep doing that. It's the Mac PC challenge here. Control plus. And now in this area, I'm going to once again, I'm going to once again use the clone stamp tool. So I'll come here into clone stamp. I'm still using the grass brush. My brush needs to be much bigger. So we'll because this grass is a lot longer. So we'll increase the brush size. I'll hold down Alt to copy from this grass down here. And I'm going to cover over her foot and ultimately, I hope, her whole leg. So we'll get that a little bit further up. Yeah, right about there. Same thing here, where we're covering it up. Now notice that I'm not trying to make it solid. We need to see some of her foot coming through, but we don't need the whole foot. And you have to decide at how tall the grass is versus how far this grass is going to come up over her feet and or legs. So let's say it's about like that. So now I'm going to move this layer on the very top of the layer stack. And when I do that, when I go ahead and turn her back on, you'll see she now feels like she's sitting down into the grass or standing in the grass. If I turn the whole background on and press Control 0, she feels like she's walking through the grass rather than walking on top of it. So that's how we would integrate her into the scene. The shadow is similar to what I just did on this last one, right here, where we're working the edges of the grass. The difference being that the grass is much, much taller in this scene. So our grass brush is going to cover it a lot more. But we do the same thing with the shadow in this scene that we would with the other scene. But she obviously does need a shadow, and it's actually a fairly dark shadow to feel fully integrated. So I've managed to use up my time with you guys. What I'm asking for in your exercise for today, the 108 exercise, let's pull that back up, is to, and I think probably the best strategy would be to start with the city street and then move on to the landscape. I want you to work for at least 2 hours on this, but I don't want you to, kill yourself over trying to get both of them done. This is really about learning. It's about practicing and getting yourself comfortable with this integration. This is very much what you're going to be doing for your assignment 102, where you're integrating two things or you're masking two things. So learning how these work is very, very important. The practice of this is very important. So I want you to work on that. Again, pay a lot of attention to the light conditions in a scene. That's absolutely critical for these to come together nicely. I'll see you guys all on Wednesday. Those of you that are checking in with me today, I'll see you in your check-in sessions. I know that there were some people that I talked to on Wednesday that might drop in today during the check-ins just to get a quick look at their assignment 101s, which is due tonight. Don't forget that that's due at midnight tonight. Next, on Wednesday, we actually shift from Photoshop into InDesign. So we're going to start doing something slightly different. So I look forward to sharing that with you on Wednesday. Before I let you go, are there any questions? Nope. All right. Sounds good. I'll see you guys in your check-ins today.